Good morning, Lisi, Lily, and Vivi. Good morning, little girls and boys of the world. Welcome to episode 1 of The Princess Show. This show was named The Princess Show by Lisi. Lisi is my oldest daughter. My name is Eva Sanchez and I am a poet. And I love to speak. Therefore, my little daughters fell in love with my speaking, and they started to want to podcast. Now, about 2 days ago, or I shall start with the beginning of this podcast. I created this podcast because my children started wanting to podcast themselves after they saw me with a microphone and heard my voice, because I've already been podcasting about poetry. So they would record their voice and post it by accident on one of my podcasts. So then I would have the little ones making noise and talking, singing, and all kinds of stuff on, like, for example, my poetry podcast, and then I will have to go delete it. So then I decided to create a show that will be the very last show that I would create, so that if they ever decided to post anything, or if they ever by mistake posted anything, it will automatically go to their own show, and it sat there with 0 episodes for a while. And then one day I decided to use it, because I spend a lot of time away from my little girls, and I want a way to be able to speak with them when I'm far away. This is one of those instances when I'm far away from them. I love you guys. I'll be coming this afternoon, but for now, I'm working. So we tried to read a story about 2 days ago, and that was going to be our very first episode. I was doing this with my 3 daughters, but it just did not turn out. We were not ready necessarily. So the story we were reading is a story about Mark Antony and Cleopatra. And it is an adaptation of a Shakespeare story for children. It's a little pack of books that we bought for our kids a while back before they could read or anything. And it's an amazing little collection. I wonder, is Shakespeare for children? And that kind of gives me the guidelines, I'm not sure if that would be the right word, but to decide who should listen to this. So this podcast is somewhat geared for older little girls, not for little babies. Okay, so Shakespeare definitely talks about a lot of sad stuff, and I do not want any little girls or boys to get sad in any way. If anything, definitely always try to learn from all lessons, positive and negative lessons. That's what life's experiences are. It's lessons. So, I wonder what I should talk to little kids about when I'm not with my children, because what this podcast is going to be is episodes of me with my children, maybe telling stories, singing songs, and reading poems, and episodes of me, mommy, far away, speaking to her babies. That's what it is right now. So, I could not read the book, and I don't have it with me. So, but this story is one I know very well. And I think it was the perfect story to begin this. My oldest daughter just picked it out of the blue. she's the one who picked the name for this podcast. I asked her, what do you want your podcast's name to be? And she said, a princess show. So, I think Cleopatra was perfect to begin this show with, because I already know so much about Cleopatra that I can sit here and talk forever about her without needing to do any kind of extra research. So, for this show, we're gonna be friends. So we're gonna call Cleopatra Cleo. Wouldn't that be fun? Okay, so we're gonna do this as fast as possible. So, Cleopatra. Who is Cleopatra, or who was Cleopatra? Where was Cleopatra from? Cleopatra was born in Egypt, ancient Egypt. My children, when I asked them this question, said that Cleopatra was from the pyramids. Now, this is not entirely correct, but what they know Egypt by is the pyramids. Now, and I explained this to them, and now I'm explaining this again. Cleopatra didn't have anything to do with the building of the pyramids, and the pyramids were already very ancient by the time Cleopatra was born. Cleopatra and other Egyptians of her time would have called those people, the ancients who built the pyramids and other amazing Egyptian monuments that are not as famous, they were referred to as the great ancestors, and they were looked upon with great amazement, and they knew that there was a lot of wonderful things back in those ages that were gone already. So Egypt was already very ancient by the time Cleopatra came into that world. And an interesting fact is this: Cleopatra was the last pharaoh of Egypt. A pharaoh would have been the king of Egypt, and they were regarded as gods or the descendants of gods. But where was Cleopatra from? Was she an Egyptian? No. She was born in Egypt, and she had a great love for Egypt, or at least that's what's been passed down to us. We don't necessarily know. We will never meet Cleopatra in this time, in this lifetime. But that's what is said, that Cleopatra loved Egyptian, and in fact, Cleopatra was a Greek. What does this mean? Cleopatra was pharaoh of Egypt. We were not told Cleopatra was Greek. Cleopatra is an Egyptian. Well, about 300 years before Cleopatra was born, another amazing person from history, who is somebody who we definitely have to talk about, was Alexander the Great. This name might seem familiar, maybe not as much as Cleopatra's, but Alexander was a great figure 300 years before Cleopatra was born. Alexander the Great was a Greek from the island of Macedon. And Alexander wanted to conquer the world. Now, he did not accomplish this. He died too early. But when Alexander died, he had conquered Egypt. Now, the Egyptians were very thankful to Alexander because he actually threw out the bad guys who were in charge of Egypt then, and he was made a pharaoh. or at least that's what history tells us. Once again, we never really will know because history was written by the winners. So we're only getting one side of the story usually. So when Alexander died, he was the Pharaoh of Egypt. Now, obviously, the Pharaoh's position, I guess, would go to his oldest son. When Alexander died, he did not have any sons, so he did not have anybody to leave his empire to. So when he died, his empire was divided between his generals. He had a few great close generals, and his greatest general, or maybe the strongest, took over Egypt as the Pharaoh. No doubt there would have been a great struggle to choose who would rule where. These were not nice, sweet times. So that great general who became the Pharaoh of Egypt after Alexander's passing was Ptolemy. Ptolemy became the Pharaoh of Egypt. He adopted Egyptian tradition, and he formed his own, I guess, Pharaoh family, his own dynasty that I believe is called the Ptolemaic dynasty. I may not know how to say it properly. So Cleopatra and Alexander may have been somewhat related. She definitely saw him as an ancestor and a great figure and somebody to follow and as an inspiration in many other ways. So Cleopatra apparently had a great sense of her ancestry that apparently was big for her. So I have some notes. I'm going to go through them. So Cleopatra was born in Egypt, but she is a Greek. And now this is very interesting. Cleopatra was the only one of her family, of all the Ptolemies, of all those about 300 years, who spoke Egyptian. All the other ones saw themselves as Greek and spoke Greek. But Cleopatra actually spoke Egyptian. That's why I think that she was really in touch with both the Greek side of her family and the Egyptian that she had somewhat inherited. So let's talk a little bit about her family. And her family life was not happy at all, you guys. But it kind of has to be touched because we cannot talk about her story. Her story is not happy. No happy ending. Cleopatra had an older sister who passed away early on. It is a very sad story. We're not going to repeat it. Cleopatra also had a younger brother and a younger sister. Cleopatra, we were going to call her Cleo. Cleo and their younger brother and sisters were enemies. Terrible enemies. Cleo was very smart. We already touched that. She was famous for speaking several languages. Cleopatra, like I said, was the only one who actually spoke Greek in her family. And actually, I didn't say this first about her family, but after her older sister passed away, Cleopatra would have been the oldest child and the one who would be next to rule. Now, obviously, it would be a boy in these times who would become the pharaoh. However, later on, the brother is gone out of the story, and that's how Cleopatra, even though a woman, becomes the ruling force in Egypt at this time. So the pharaoh, and she ruled alone. She did not have a husband. But that's also not a happy ending. So, Cleopatra was also, of course, very interested in history. But the most amazing thing about Cleopatra was her care for her most prized possession, I would say, which is the Alexandria's library. which was at this point the biggest in the world. And is very famous still today. So this library was not just a library, but it was a place where great men and great minds would meet to talk and learn and teach. And Cleopatra would have probably been hanging out in the library, learning. So Egypt in the time of Cleopatra had, like I said, was already ancient. And Cleopatra was the last pharaoh of Egypt. So after her death, everything changed for Egypt. I am not very much familiar with the story of Egypt after Cleopatra, but I don't think it was great. Definitely that golden period was already past. However, that golden period was really only for the ruling class, not for the poor people. But by the time that Cleopatra's family, that is her father, came into power, Egypt had declined terribly, and her father was not liked at all by the Egyptian. At this point, Rome was the big bullies, the bad boys in the world. And they were fighting everybody, and they wanted money from everybody. That's how Rome became so big, is by getting paid by all the other countries out there that they defeated in wars. So now another thing that Rome would do is just be like, show up and be like, I'm bigger than you, I'm scarier than you, I will come fight you, you need to pay me a tax. So Egypt, even though I do not believe that Egypt ever fought Rome at this point, Egypt was under attack by Rome. So Egypt, to prevent being attacked by Rome, had to pay Rome a tax. And Egypt was doing very badly because of this great tax that was imposed by Rome. Now the pharaoh had accepted this tax. The Egyptians were not happy about it, and that's why they were so unhappy with Cleopatra's dad, the pharaoh. Cleopatra's dad actually had to run away from Egypt and into Rome to save his own life, because his subjects did not like him at all. So I don't know necessarily if he was a bad king, but his people were starving. Okay, so definitely Rome was in charge of the world through this time. And guess who was the biggest, baddest boy in Rome at this time? If you guessed Julius Caesar, you're right. So Cleopatra's dad kind of left his children's fate in Caesar's hand. This is very interesting because this would definitely play a big role in Cleopatra's life, especially as a young woman. Huge role. So moving forward. So during this time when Cleopatra's dad was in Rome hiding from his own subjects, his oldest daughter, who was Cleopatra's older sister, actually tried to take the throne from her father. So this is actually her sad ending. Her father, I don't want to say it, but it was a bad ending. A bad ending like you wouldn't see nowadays. A bad ending like a father and a daughter should never be involved in. I told you guys, these were sad times. These were bad times. These were terrible times. These were very, very violent times. And we should not assume that these people were like us. So we're not going to judge them. We're just going to tell their stories. Okay, so after Cleopatra's dad passed away, and I'm not sure how, Caesar came over to Egypt. To ensure that Egypt was stable, he had to put somebody in the throne. Now, like I said, Cleopatra, the oldest surviving child, and her two younger siblings were terrible enemies. They hated each other. So the two younger siblings actually ran out Cleopatra from Egypt. Yes, she had to escape. She was hiding. She was gonna be nothing. She was just gonna be some person hiding forever, or she was gonna be perhaps not alive. However, then comes Caesar to Egypt and Cleopatra. She was smart, and she was a woman, and Caesar was an older man. Cleopatra was a very young, very bright woman, extremely powerful, lots of talents. She was famous at this point for this, apparently, according to history. So Caesar came, and his plan was to marry Cleopatra to her brother, her younger brother. Again, we're not gonna judge. This was the custom of the Egyptian pharaohs. And this was to keep power in the family. And this is actually a tradition that Cleopatra's ancestors from Greek adopted when they started to rule Egypt. Okay, so Caesar came to marry Cleopatra to her younger brother. But her younger brother and her younger sister's name was Arsinoe, and her brother's name was, of course, Ptolemy, because names were just used and used and used. Arsinoe, Cleopatra's younger sister, and her younger brother Ptolemy actually ran Cleopatra out. So when Caesar got there, they're like, we don't have Cleopatra. What? Where's Cleopatra? We need Cleopatra. Cleopatra will be the ruler. We don't know. And then one day, something amazing happens. Because truth is really more interesting than any fiction. No wonder all fiction is based in some truth. Somebody, according to history, like I said, we don't really know every detail that happened 2,000 years ago, but it is said that some man shows up with a wrapped up rug. So this man comes in carrying a wrapped up rug for Caesar. And long story short, Cleopatra is inside the rug. Imagine. She would have been killed if she would have been seen entering the castle. This was a young woman. I'm not certain how young, but she would have been between 18 and 20, I believe. And she had guts. Who would do that? She risked her life, but she showed up there, and she showed up in front of Caesar, and she said probably something like this: I am Cleopatra, make me the queen. At this point, Caesar married Cleopatra and her brother, and they were both very unhappy because they hated each other passionately. And nobody knows exactly the story, and I've told you, we're not going to judge. But the bottom line is, eventually the brother was gone out of the story, and eventually the sister was out of the story. Now, what happened to Arsinoe is a very sad story. We might not go there. It's also a long story. But, yes, these were all sad stories. And I was kind of going to start in that sense. But like I said, these are lessons. This is not for you to get sad. These are lessons. We're going to talk about the lessons later on. I don't want to talk too long, so let me see. Okay, so the bottom line is that the two younger siblings, the ones that were enemies of Cleopatra, were gone because Cleopatra became more powerful. And guess how? Some of you may already know that Cleopatra and Caesar fell for each other, and they had a great love affair. Very famous love affair. Now, is it right or not? We are not going to judge. We're just going to explain, and we're just going to tell. These were two very powerful people who had some of the same wants and likes, and maybe they would have been great as a couple. However, they were not destined to be because they were from different countries, and in this time and age, that was not the case. Caesar had to marry a Roman woman, and he did, and Cleopatra was meant to marry actually her brother, which she did, but after he passed, she was just a black widow. So that's that for now. So Cleopatra and Caesar had, of course, a love affair. Now, Rome did not like this at all, and Caesar's demise came, apparently, somewhat as a result of this. He had other issues that we're not going to talk about right now because it's not Caesar's story, it's Cleopatra's story. So Caesar had other issues, but one of the reasons why the Romans did not like him anymore is because of Cleopatra. So, yes, they had that love affair. Caesar put Cleopatra in charge, and he somewhat, maybe perhaps, got rid of his younger brother and sister. Both of them together. Caesar definitely wanted Cleopatra in charge because Cleopatra had his interests in mind. So Caesar's death came at the hand of his Roman Senate and some people who definitely knew him. So after this passed comes the end of Cleopatra and ancient Egypt as we knew it with pharaohs. The end is a sad ending, so we're gonna simplify it quite a lot. After Caesar's passing, there were 3 people in charge of Rome. One of them was the outsider. Don't we usually see these in groups of 3? So the outsider was Mark Antony, Caesar's right-hand man. Mark Antony was a younger man than Caesar and somebody who was not as strong and skilled as Caesar, but he was great as a right-hand man. Mark Antony also fell in love with Cleopatra, and apparently it was deadly for him. Cleopatra was much stronger than Mark Antony. She had already been a ruler. He had not. And it is my belief that Cleopatra probably pushed them to get her way. What do I mean? Cleopatra, like her ancestor Alexander, wanted the rule of the world. Now this was not to be, and this was not for her. She wanted too much. Was it only her? No, Caesar wanted exactly this, and that's why Cleopatra and Caesar clicked. Now, when Caesar was gone and out of the picture, Cleopatra must have assumed that Mark Antony was going to continue this. Mark Antony, on the other hand, was not strong enough, and immediately the other Romans went against him because, again, the Romans did not want to align with the Egyptians in this way. They did not want to mix. They wanted power and to rule. So there was a terrible, terrible war. Many people died, including Cleopatra and Mark Antony. So, and this was the end of the pharaohs in Egypt. So, was the end trying to rule over the world? Most definitely, I believe so. Nobody should rule over the whole world. Not one person, not one country, not one anything. So, the good news is, as long as you're not ruling over the world, something like this will not happen to you. So, I was going to talk a little bit, this is the end of this story, by the way. I was going to talk a little bit about the name of this podcast, A Princess Show. And that's why it was perfect to start with Cleopatra. Cleopatra obviously started as a princess and became a queen called a pharaoh in her day. She was actually like a queen and king because she didn't have a husband. and definitely a very powerful woman from history. But my point is, and when like I said, the name of this podcast came from my oldest daughter. I asked her, what should the name be? And she said, very simply, A Princess Show, because she loves princesses. Who could blame her? I do too. However, in history, princesses were not always happy. This is the lesson of this story. Don't go out there and try to be a princess. Don't go out there and try to get power. If you want to learn from Cleopatra, learn that learning and knowledge are huge, crucial, and very important. Learn languages. If you want to be like Cleopatra, imitate the good in her. There's definitely a lot of good. Like I said, she had this great thirst for knowledge and for keeping knowledge that was ancient. And she seemed to have had a great love of her ancestors and her inheritance. And that, I think, is what we should imitate about Cleopatra. Thank you so much for listening, and I really hope you got something from this. And we will talk again soon for sure. You will hear my little daughter's voices eventually, and you will hear mommy talking to you. Stories, most likely from history. And definitely we'll talk about princesses and about queens, and we'll talk about goddesses, and we'll talk about men too, because also men are very important in our lives. And we'll talk about life. And we'll talk about love, because those are mommy's favorite topics to talk about. And most important of all. So if you want to talk about love in the Cleopatra story, because obviously family relationships were volatile in this environment and in this time. Yes, Cleopatra's dad sort of had his oldest daughter murdered. But like I said, his daughter literally stole the throne from her dad. So it was not just a dad being bad relationship, it was also a daughter who stole from her dad. And the punishment was bad, but that's the environment that they lived in back then. Another lesson is, do not judge the past by today's standards. No, don't do that. The past was very different. Anyways, thank you so much for listening, and I hope that you enjoyed this. And if you did, follow this, because we'll talk a lot more coming up. I definitely love to be in touch with children, and I am getting in touch with my inner child. And I love children, of course. I have 3 of them. My lovely little girls. I love you guys. I love you, Lizzie. I love you, Lily. And I love you, Vivi. And thank you so much for listening. And listen again soon. Thanks. This is your good friend, Eva Sanchez. Mommy. Bye-bye.